The wagon came in low on its axles, dragging one wheel worse than the others, and it stopped on its own before the man driving it thought to pull the brake. Silas Ward stepped down from the porch of the way station at Cutbank Draw with a tin cup still in his hand, and he saw the driver was already gone. Not dead, only gone in the way men sometimes went when a road had asked more of them than they had left to give. The driver sat with the reins loose across his knees, staring at nothing, breathing like a man counting his own breaths. Silas set the cup on the rail without looking. He walked to the back of the wagon because that was where the sound was coming from. Small sound, held in, the sound of children who had learned that being loud was a thing a person could be punished for. He lifted the canvas. 5 faces looked back at him. 5, not 4, not 6. 2 boys and 3 girls, sorted by size the way kindling is sorted, the biggest at the front, the smallest at the back with her thumb in her mouth and her eyes wide open. The biggest, a boy of maybe 12, had a hand on the shoulder of the girl beside him and a set to his jaw that Silas recognized. It was the set of a person who had decided a long time ago that he would not be separated from the people behind him. "You lose someone on the road?" Silas asked, because there had plainly been 6 once, or 7, and something had gone wrong between wherever they had started and Cutbank Draw. "No, sir," the boy said. His voice was steady. "We only come as 5. The girl beside him nodded, and the girl behind her nodded, and the smallest one took her thumb out of her mouth long enough to nod too. It had the sound of a thing they had said before and would say again, and had decided in some counsel of their own would be the answer to every question anyone thought to ask. Silas looked at the driver, who did not look back. He looked at the sky, which was doing nothing in particular. He looked at the 5 faces in the wagon bed, and he set his hand on the tailgate where the smallest one could see it, and he smiled the small, tired, wholehearted smile of a man who has been waiting a long time for something he did not know he was waiting for. "That's perfect," he said. "Come on down. There's stew inside, and the fire's still good." The oldest boy did not move. Silas understood that too. He waited. He did not offer his hand. He did not step closer. He only stood where he was and let the boy watch him for as long as the boy needed to watch. Somewhere down the draw a magpie was arguing with itself. The wind moved once through the cottonwoods and lay back down. 5 plates, the boy said finally. 5 plates, Silas agreed. The boy climbed down first, and then he turned and lifted the smallest one out of the wagon like she was made of something breakable and expensive, and the others came after in their sorted order, and they walked in a line into the way station at Cutbank Draw, as though they had rehearsed how a person walks into a new place without giving up any ground. Before we go a step further into what happened next, and a great deal happened next, more than Silas Ward had any way of knowing when he lifted that canvas, I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a kitchen with something warm on the stove, or a porch, or a room where the light has gone low and the day is finally letting you rest. Say the name of your town in the comments if you'd like. I read them, and it means more than you know to picture where this story is landing. Silas Ward had run the way station at Cutbank Draw for 11 years, alone for 6 of them, since his wife Ellen had gone under the sod behind the smokehouse on a morning that had no business being as bright as it was. He kept the station because the stage still ran the northern loop twice a week, and because the small ranchers in the valley needed a place to leave a letter, buy a nail, or wait out a storm without paying town prices. He kept it because Ellen had loved it, and because leaving it would have felt like leaving her a second time. He was a man who mended his own boots, kept his own books, and spoke to the horses more than he spoke to most people, and he had a way of standing in a doorway that made travelers feel, without knowing why, that they had arrived somewhere safe. The driver's name was Harlan Pike, and by the time the stew was on the table Harlan had drunk 2 cups of water and remembered how to talk. He had picked the children up in Miles City from a woman named Miss Ada who ran what she called a home and what everyone else called a holding pen, and he had been paid to take them as far as the receiving family at 2 Medicine, which was another 2 days north. There was no receiving family at 2 Medicine anymore. The receiving family at 2 Medicine had written in June saying they were sorry, but the man had taken sick, and by the time Miss Ada's letter came back the man had died and the woman had gone to her sister in Oregon, and Miss Ada had put the letter under a stack of other letters and sent the children anyway because she had already been paid. Harlan Pike had not known any of this until he stopped in Big Timber, and a telegraph clerk who knew the 2 Medicine family told him. He had thought about turning the wagon around. He had thought about going on. He had thought about a great many things on the long stretch between Big Timber and Cutbank Draw. And what he had finally done was stop where the road bent past Silas Ward's station, because he had once seen Silas quietly pay for a widow's freight without letting her see him do it. And he had decided, on the strength of that one memory, that this was the door he would knock on. "I don't have papers," Harlan said. "Miss Ada wouldn't give me any. She said papers were for people who paid extra." "Papers can be made," Silas said. "They came as 6, Harlan said. His hands were shaking now that they had nothing to hold. "There was a boy, older than Josiah there, and about a day out of Miles City he asked me to stop the wagon so he could relieve himself, and he walked into the sagebrush, and he kept walking, and I called for him for an hour, and Josiah came up to me and put his hand on my arm and said, 'Mister, we only come as 5. Just that. And the little ones nodded like it was catechism. So I stopped calling." Silas looked across the room to where the 5 of them were sitting in a line on the bench by the stove, each with a bowl, none of them eating until the biggest one, Josiah, took his first spoonful. Then all 5 ate at once, in the same rhythm, watching each other's bowls to make sure nobody fell behind. "He didn't run because he didn't want them," Silas said, half to himself. "He ran because he thought 5 was a number somebody might take. 6 was too many." Harlan Pike did not answer. He did not need to. Word gets down a valley faster than a horse can carry it. By the second morning, Ephraim Doakes had ridden out from the town of Bell Fork with 2 men behind him and a paper folded in his coat pocket, and Silas saw them coming from a half-mile off because he had been watching the road since before sunrise. Doakes owned the freight contract, the mercantile, the water rights on the upper creek, and, through a nephew, the seat on the county board that decided which children in the district were placed where. He was a smooth, unhurried man who wore a good hat and did not raise his voice, and he had spent 15 years turning Bell Fork into a place that worked exactly the way Ephraim Doakes wanted it to work. He rode into the yard and did not dismount. "Ward," he said. "Doakes, I hear you took in a wagon of orphans yesterday." "I did. There's a family in Livingston that has been waiting 6 months for children. A good family. Church-going. They can take 3. There's 5. 3 is what they can take. The other 2 will find placements. There's a rancher up on the Muscle Shell, needs a boy who can work. There's a family in Bell Fork that could use a girl for the kitchen." Silas set his hand on the top rail of the corral, the way a man sets his hand on a thing he owns, and he looked at Ephraim Doakes for a long moment before he answered. "They come as 5, he said. "That's not how it works." "It's how it works here." Doakes smiled. It was not an unfriendly smile. It was the smile of a man who has never lost an argument he cared about and did not expect to lose this one. "You're not a license placement, Ward. You're a way station. The county has a procedure. I'd hate to see it come to a procedure." "Then don't let it," Silas said. Doakes touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse, and the 2 men behind him turned with him, and they rode out at the same unhurried pace they had ridden in. Silas stood at the corral rail until they were out of sight, and then he went inside to where the 5 of them were sitting at the long table, and he sat down across from Josiah, and he said what he had come inside to say. "There's a man in town who thinks 5 is too many," he told the boy. "I don't, but I want to hear it from you. Do you want to stay here?" Josiah looked at him a long time. Then he looked at the 4 behind him, one at a time, in their sorted order. "We only come as 5, he said. "That's my answer too," said Silas. "I want to ask you something, and I mean it plainly. What do you think Josiah was really saying in that answer he had rehearsed with the little ones on the road? Was it a promise, or a warning, or a prayer? Sit with that for a moment. There's no wrong answer. The story will hold." Because the story did not stay quiet. The next week brought a letter from the county clerk with the seal on it and language in it that made Silas read it twice by lamplight before he set it down. It said that a hearing had been scheduled in 21 days at the Bell Fork courthouse to determine the proper placement of the 5 minor children currently in the informal care of Silas Ward, way station operator, Cutbank Draw. It said that Mr. Ephraim Doakes had filed a concerned citizen's petition. It said that the children would be interviewed separately by the county's appointed woman, and that Mr. Ward was welcome to present any documentation he possessed regarding his qualifications as a guardian, which the letter, in its polite way, made clear the county did not expect him to have. Silas folded the letter and put it in the tin box on the mantel where Ellen's letters had been, and he went out to the barn and stood for a long time with his hand on the neck of the buckskin mare, and he did what he had done every hard day since Ellen had died. He thought about what she would have done, and he did that. He rode to Livingston. He came back 3 days later with a woman named Nell Rourke, who was Ellen's second cousin and who had, 30 years ago, been the first schoolteacher at Cutbank Draw before she went east to marry a lawyer who had died young and left her more time than she knew what to do with. Nell was 61 years old, had a straight back, a soft laugh, and a way of listening to a child that made the child feel, correctly, that she was the most important person in the room. She sat in the wagon beside Silas as they came down the last slope toward the station, and she saw the 5 of them lined up on the porch waiting, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Silas Ward, you did not tell me the smallest one was named for someone." "I didn't know it," Silas said. "Her name is Ellen. I asked yesterday at the telegraph office in Big Timber. I sent a wire ahead." Miss Ada answered before I finished tea. Silas Ward pulled the wagon up in front of the porch and set the brake carefully, because his hands were not quite steady. He looked at the smallest of the 5, thumb in her mouth, watching him with the enormous solemn eyes of a child who has been paying attention her whole short life, and he understood what it means when the world closes a loop it had opened a long time ago. "Ellen," he said, just to hear it. She took her thumb out of her mouth. "Yes, sir," she said. Nell Rourke moved into the smaller cabin behind the smokehouse, which Silas had built one summer for a hired hand who never came. She took charge of the children's days without ever seeming to take charge of anything. She read to them at the long table after supper. She taught the girls to braid ryegrass into small stiff mats and taught the boys to read a page of scripture without dropping their voices at the ends of the sentences. She wrote letters, quiet, careful, unhurried letters, to a woman she had known in the state capitol who worked in the office that reviewed placement petitions, and she did not mention this to Silas because she did not want him to hope for a thing that might not come. What Silas did was different, and it was the thing that mattered in the end. Silas kept books. He had always kept books. It was the one skill his father had beaten into him that he did not resent, because it turned out to be the skill on which a way station lived or died. He kept a ledger of every wagon that stopped, every letter he forwarded, every pound of flour he sold, every night a traveler slept on his floor. He kept a ledger of the horses in his corral, and the feed they ate and the shoes they wore through. And starting the day the 5 children arrived, without saying anything to anyone, he began keeping a new ledger. He wrote down what each child ate at each meal. He wrote down what each child said, when they said something worth writing down. He wrote down the day Josiah first laughed, which was the 8th day, when the smallest Ellen fell off the porch step into a puddle and stood up covered in mud and said, with tremendous dignity, "I did not intend that." He wrote down the day the middle girl, whose name was Ruthie, asked if she could help him mend a bridle, and the day the second boy, Caleb, brought him a nail he had found in the yard because he had noticed that Silas kept every nail. He wrote down the weather. He wrote down the pounds of vegetables the older girl, Maddie, put up from the kitchen garden, which was more than Silas had ever put up alone. He wrote down what Nell taught, and what the children learned, and the exact date each of them first slept through the night, without waking with the small choked sound of a child dreaming about a wagon. He was not building a defense. He was building a record. He did not entirely know the difference until the morning of the hearing. The Belfort Courthouse was a plain plank building with a stove in the corner and a wooden bench for the public and a table at the front where the county judge, a tired man named Wren, sat with a stack of papers and a pair of spectacles he cleaned every few minutes on the tail of his shirt. Ephraim Doakes sat at one side of the room in a good suit with his lawyer beside him. Silas sat at the other side with Nell Rourke, and the 5 children sat in a straight line behind him in their sorted order, with Josiah on the aisle. The county's appointed woman had spent the previous afternoon interviewing each child alone. She stood now and told Judge Wren, in a careful voice, that all 5 children had said, without prompting and without variation, that they wished to remain together at Cutbank Draw with Mr. Ward and Mrs. Rourke. She said the youngest had said this by nodding vigorously while holding a small wooden horse that Mr. Ward had carved for her. She said the oldest had said it while looking her directly in the eye and using a phrase she had written down verbatim. "What phrase?" the judge asked. "We only come as 5, ma'am." That was the phrase. Doakes's lawyer stood. He spoke smoothly and well. He said that the wishes of children, while touching, were not the standard by which the county made placement decisions. He said the standard was the fitness of the guardian, the stability of the household, and the demonstrated capacity to provide for the children's welfare. He said Mr. Ward, whatever his personal qualities, was an unmarried man operating a commercial establishment on a public road, without formal training, without a license, without documentation, and without, frankly, any evidence beyond his own word that he was in fact caring for these children in any meaningful way. Then Silas Ward stood up, and he laid the ledger on the table in front of Judge Wren. Then he laid a second ledger beside it, which was the letters Nell Rourke had written to the state capitol and the answers that had come back. Then he laid a third thing, which was a folded page in Josiah's careful, uneven handwriting, listing every chore each child had chosen for themselves, signed at the bottom by all five with the smallest Ellen's mark in place of a signature. "That's my evidence," Silas said. "It's 187 days of it. Read as much as you like." Judge Wren read for 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. The stove ticked. The smallest Ellen fell asleep against Maddie's shoulder, and Maddie did not move an inch for fear of waking her. Ephraim Doakes sat very still in his good suit, and the smile he had worn when he rode into the yard 3 weeks ago was not on his face anymore, because he was a smart man, and smart men know the sound of an argument they are losing. Judge Wren took off his spectacles and cleaned them one last time, and he set them down, and he looked at Silas. "Mr. Ward," he said, "in 22 years on this bench, I have never seen a private citizen present the county with a record of care that would embarrass the county's own institutions. I am going to place these children in your and Mrs. Rourke's guardianship, jointly, effective today. If Mr. Doakes wishes to appeal, he is welcome to try, but I will tell him plainly that I do not expect his appeal to succeed, because the standard is welfare, and the welfare is in that ledger." Ephraim Doakes stood up. He did not argue. He walked out of the courthouse with his lawyer behind him, and by the following spring the freight contract had passed to a younger man, and by the spring after that the seat on the county board had been quietly filled by someone whose name was not Doakes, and Ephraim himself had moved to a smaller house at the edge of Bell Fork, where he was seen most afternoons on his porch, watching the road, no longer the man the road turned around for. That evening, back at Cutbank Draw, the 6 of them, because there were 6 of them now, plus Nell, sat at the long table with a stew Maddie had made almost entirely on her own, and Silas found he could not quite lift his spoon for a moment. Josiah saw. Josiah always saw. "You all right, sir?" the boy asked. "I'm all right," Silas said. "You could take the head of the table," Josiah said. "It's your house." Silas looked at the boy, 12 years old, sitting where he had sat since the first meal, at the front of the sorted line, and Silas shook his head. "You sit where you sit," Silas said. "I'll sit where I sit. This works." Later, when the dishes were done and the little ones were asleep and Nell had gone to her cabin, Silas sat on the porch with Josiah for the first hour of what would become a nightly habit of theirs, and neither of them said much of anything, which was the point. The wind moved once through the cottonwoods. A coyote spoke a mile off, and another one answered. Josiah leaned his shoulder against the post and said, without looking at Silas, "I was scared you'd only want the little ones." "I figured you were," Silas said. "That's why I said what I said. At the wagon." "I know." Josiah was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Nobody ever said perfect before. Not about us." Silas looked at the boy's profile in the low light and thought about Ellen, and about the 6 years alone, and about the road that had bent one particular wagon toward one particular door on one particular afternoon, and he did not say any of that. What he said was smaller. "It was the only true word I had," Silas said. "If this story has settled something warm in your chest tonight, that's the feeling I want to keep making for you. A quiet like and a subscribe tells me you want more of these stories, and it costs nothing but a tap. Take a breath. If it moved you, let it move your finger too. Then come the rest of the way with me. There isn't much left, and it's the part that lasts." 5 years passed at Cutbank Draw the way years pass in places where people are doing the work in front of them. Maddie grew tall and quiet and read every book Nell brought back from Livingston. And at 17, she was accepted to the state normal school on a letter of recommendation Nell wrote in one sitting and did not revise. Caleb built a small forge behind the barn with money he earned shoeing horses for the neighbors, and by 19, he was the man the small ranchers rode 20 miles to see. Ruthie stayed close, and turned out to have Silas's exact patience with animals, and by 20 she was running most of the corral and half the ledgers. The smallest Ellen grew up long-legged and serious, and could ride anything with hair on it by the time she was 10. Josiah stayed. Josiah had always been going to stay. At 22, he was the man who stood in the doorway now, and travelers coming down the road at dusk saw his silhouette and felt, without knowing why, that they had arrived somewhere safe. He had learned that from someone. He knew who. On an afternoon in late September, with the cottonwoods turning and the light doing the thing the light does in that country in that month, Silas Ward walked out to the smokehouse to check the smoke. And on his way back he stopped where Ellen was buried, and he stood there with his hat in his hand. Behind him, from the porch, he could hear the smallest Ellen, not so small anymore, laughing at something Caleb had said, and Ruthie answering, and the low, steady voice of Nell reading a letter aloud to Maddie who had come home for the harvest. 5 voices. He counted them without meaning to. He always counted them. Josiah came out and stood beside him. They did not speak for a while. The magpies were arguing again, the same argument, unresolved after all these years. "I put a stone in," Josiah said. "For her. Next to yours. When the time comes. I hope that's all right." "That's all right," Silas said. "There's room enough for all of us out here, eventually," Josiah said. "I checked." Silas smiled, the small, tired, wholehearted smile of a man who had been given more than he had known how to ask for. And he set his hand on the boy's shoulder, and he said the thing that had waited 5 years to be said out loud, arriving now almost accidentally, on the way back from the smokehouse, with nothing in particular happening around it. "They said we only come as 5, Silas said. Turned out that was just the number it took to make a family whole. The wind moved once through the cottonwoods and lay back down. From the porch, someone called them into supper. They went. Next time, I want to tell you the story of a young widow who arrived at a mountain trading post in a snowstorm with nothing but a locked wooden box and a name she would not say out loud, and the old trapper who recognized the handwriting on the box before she ever set it down. I'll see you then. Rest easy tonight."